And welcome back. The Blueprint for Change transition plan aims to privatize scores of public housing residents, which will permanently eliminate thousands of affordable housing units in NYC, as well as put over 100,000 working class Black, Indigenous, and other people of color at risk of homelessness. The Blueprint for Change was introduced in July 2020, just following the first wave of a pandemic, which was twice as fatal for NYCHA residents as the city overall. Joining us now to discuss more is the founder of Ojala Threads and NYCHA Tenant, Ramona Ferreyra. And then we've also got founder of the Bronx Institute for Urban Systems, Cesar Yoc, and Justice for All Coalition member, Kristen Hackett. And thank you all for joining us for a much needed conversation at a time like this. Thank you guys. I'll start off first by going to you first, Ramona, to share with us a little bit about where we are and your concerns, particularly as it pertains to NYCHA.
So the last time that we had appeared on the show, we were discussing the danger that is the blueprint legislation. And we're really interested in updating New Yorkers and those that are supportive of public housing throughout the city on what's happened with the blueprint legislation, and also the campaign that we began to kill the bill. It's what it's called. So the state tried to introduce the legislation back in December, and it was clear that advocates and tenants did not support it. They tried again right before this legislative session ended, giving us about a week and a half to organize and really, counter the blueprint. And once again, we were able to convince the legislature, the state legislature, that it is not a plan that NYCHA tenants or advocates or those with a legal background support. Unfortunately, the state legislature leads have made it clear that they will continue to try to introduce the blueprint. And we anticipate that they're going to do this again when the legislative calendar opens up. So because of that, we're spending our summer doing teach-ins and supporting family days, which are, traditional block parties that happen at every NYCHA development. At these, we are educating tenants on what the blueprint is, because only a small percentage has actually heard of the plan. When the president of NYCHA was holding forums on it, only about 2,500 people participated. And we have a community that is 400,000 at this point, which means that there's a huge need for outreach and education. So we are trying to fill that gap, which NYCHA is not serving. And we are also calling for the immediate removal of the president of NYCHA, Greg Russ. As you mentioned in the intro, NYCHA tenants were affected and died from COVID at twice the rate of other New Yorkers. And one of the key reasons that has come to, be exposed is that at the beginning of the pandemic, NYCHA was warned that if they didn't change our filter system, our actual exhaust vents, that there would be more COVID infections amongst NYCHA tenants and ultimately more deaths. Instead of focusing on, critical and urgent matters such as this, the current NYCHA president has dedicated his time and significant assets, as far as we can see, at least $200,000 on trying to convince tenants of the blueprint legislation and telling tenants that the blueprint legislation is the answer. And we have had it with having conversations with him. And at this point, we're calling for his immediate removal.
Yeah, I want to talk a little bit about that, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. I want to cover a couple of topics first before we get there. And I'll bring Cesar in to talk a little bit about the Green New Deal for public housing, because when we talk about public housing and green does not always go hand in hand. Talk to us about the Green New Deal for public housing.
First, I wanted to talk a little bit about what NYCHA is doing. So, and then I could talk about the Green New Deal for public housing. They're connected to each other. So NYCHA, around 2017, they started the sustainability agenda. So now they have a new recent report in 2020 about the sustainability agenda. So in there, it has about energy and carbon, health and well-being. And then the sustainability goal number 5 is economics. So they talk about the trust and then PAC. So in that report, it seems like they're trying to get funds from those initiatives, to fulfill the sustainability agenda. So then as to the Green New Deal for public housing is to see public housing in a different way. The Green New Deal for public housing is not only NYCHA, is public housing throughout the whole United States. So AOC introduced it. Me and other people from Movement School, we worked together to put together this bill. I included some things there in the bill, and then it was introduced around, I think around June of last year, to retrofit housing, use energy initiatives. Housing consumes a lot of energy. A lot of energy is lost through the way the buildings are constructed. So the Green New Deal tries to focus on that, and also to have more ways of tenants to be able to participate in greening public housing. So Green New Deal for public housing does that. But for us, it's also trying to find another mechanism that, regardless of where the funds come from, NYCHA should go to a new age of sustainability, because a lot of the final thing I would say regarding that is that a lot of these buildings are near the waterfront. And when Sandy hit, some of these areas were devastated by Sandy. So with climate change, and this might happen a little bit more, as you notice, there have been more rainy days in this summer. So that's gonna happen a little bit more. So that's a little bit about the Green New Deal for public housing.
Yeah, and we know the deal was also introduced in 2019. Talk to us about where it stands right now.
So right now is being pushed nationally. Before, when I was helping, it was more focused in NYCHA per se, more in the city. But then Sunrise Movement, it started pushing it more at a national level in order to pass this legislation. So like I said, it was introduced by AOC. It's still out there. It's not yet in committee to be go for voting, but it's still a great push, like I said, nationally to.
Yeah. Let me bring Kristen in and talk a little bit about rental assistance, and you can speak to us a little bit more about the rental assistance demonstration.
Okay, so rental assistance demonstration is a national policy that was developed under Obama in 2012 and is now privatizing public housing across the country. There's a larger context here. So since the 70s and 80s, when Section 8 was actually created, the national housing policy direction has been towards subsidizing private investment in housing, which is really different than what we see with public housing, which is direct investment, public investment in housing. And so this has increasingly put public housing on the chopping block, where at the national level, increasingly congressional representatives, many of whom have ties to real estate developers or affordable housing industry leaders, have increasingly been calling for the privatization of public housing. And we saw Hope 6 in the 90s, which decimated public housing in Cincinnati, in Chicago, and in St. Louis. Cabrini Green, the explosion of Cabrini Green is perhaps like something that sticks in people's memories. And then we see that didn't apply to NYCHA at the time, because buildings in NYCHA in New York City, public housing, were not in the disrepair that they're in today. So they actually didn't qualify for Hope 6 at the time. So RAD was a kind of a subsequent privatization plan that emerged in 2012 under Obama, and is a national program that now has privatized, I want to say, more than 200,000 units nationally. They could privatize as many as 500,000 right now, because there is a cap limiting the number of units that they can privatize nationally. But the way that these privatize the buildings is that they bring in private managers to manage the properties. In some cases, public housing authorities are actually selling off their entire public housing portfolios to private developers and managers. In New York City, we see the city is maintaining a stake in the properties. It varies by deal. So at Ocean Bay, I think they have a 51% stake in the property, but that can be different at different developments that are being converted. But then they lease the property to private developers for 99 years, which is greater than most lifetimes. right? So from a human perspective, this is privatization, even though the city is maintaining that leasehold interest. But then the everyday management responsibilities are being transferred to private developers and managers, and construction is also being outsourced to those companies. And when we look at the long list of companies that are being selected, we see that these are some of the most egregious private managers in the country, in the city, with histories of eviction and tenant harassment. So a lot of emphasis has been placed on Wavecrest because they are well known for high rates of eviction and tenant harassment, especially after they took over a lot of rents stabilized buildings about 10 years ago. But that's their emblem. They're not an exception, right? They're emblematic of the private partners that the city is involving in these deals. C+C Management is another egregious actor operating in the realm of affordable housing in New York City, who is now moving into public housing through the RAD program, who has, again, histories of eviction and tenant harassment and being a slumlord and things like that. So that's what RAD is.
Yeah. I want to bring Ramona in and talk a little bit about where we are today, because obviously with COVID has further exacerbated some things as far as NYCHA tenants are concerned. Give us an update as to what you can tell us about the state of NYCHA and the way things are going, particularly in COVID, because I've talked to several people who say, COVID has already hard hit the area, but when it comes to NYCHA, it just seems like to have in some ways decimated some places.
Yeah, so things have been, there hasn't really been much improvement in NYCHA. When we had the first big wave of COVID in New York City, NYCHA really failed to properly sanitize, clean, and protect tenants. And that trend has continued. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we were all told that NYCHA would have to take measures to keep staff and residents safe. And that led to any repairs being canceled. Now, NYCHA has not reversed this policy yet. So what's happened is that for the last year and couple months, folks have been waiting on much needed repairs and not getting those. Now, we believe that the reason that NYCHA has not revamped, their work schedule and is not providing sufficient staff to get things done is because a key component of the blueprint is that HUD has to find our apartments obsolete. So finding them obsolete means that the apartment in itself is a danger to those that live there. And more importantly, it requires a tenant protection voucher be issued from HUD. And that tenant protection voucher is, building on what Kristen just explained, is what actually pays the actual management company to take care of the unit and bring it up to code. So we actually feel that it's been a strategic decision on the part of Greg Russ to not complete repairs and to not support properties and to really be the last to respond. You'll remember last year, folks were doing food drives, doing, community refrigerators, getting face masks. We saw tenant association presidents taking on the lead roles in, really complicated situations and putting themselves at risk at a time where NYCHA was not providing any support. Even with the recent family days, NYCHA put out rules requiring certain COVID measures, demanding additional paperwork, basically complicating the process for tenant association presidents, but not providing any support. And when we've asked, I asked, directly of Janelle Hudson over email for support so that tenants would get, more information from the Department of Health, Board of Elections and other city agencies at family days. We never got an answer back from Janelle Hudson, right? So this is someone that's supposed to be leading resident engagement. And as we recover from this pandemic, we are not seeing resident engagement or NYCHA really step forward. So things have not improved for residents, but surprisingly so when they understand what the blueprint does, which is really privatize our homes and then allow private investors to play with the values of our homes. Nobody wants that. Folks are willing to not get a new refrigerator and new stove, which is what NYCHA loves to give people as a promise, and hold on to what is Section 9 housing, right? So Section 9 housing is public housing as defined by Congress. And NYCHA does not understand that we do not accept any plans that remove us from Section 9. So things, they really haven't improved. I would say the one thing that has gotten better is tenant involvement, engagement in education, groups like Safe Section 9, the coalition that we're in, which includes Justice for All. It includes CAV, Organizing for Asian Americans, and other organizations. We're doing the work repeatedly and daily that NYCHA should be doing, but they're not.
So, Cesar, I'll bring you back in to talk a little bit more. When we talk about really NYCHA doing the work, this Green Deal really helps and assists NYCHA in getting the ball across the finish line in a whole lot better way. What can you tell us when it comes to really that public participation, and really, because you're talking about it hasn't made it to committee yet, but how has it been going in terms of getting the word out and getting people to really urge these electeds to get behind the Green New Deal, to accept some responsibility, and to really put things forthright for the people of NYCHA?
The Green New Deal for public housing is a push, like I said, it's a national level. I haven't been actually involved that much recently. In any form, whatever the funds come from, is to use a lot of these principles and goals of the Green New Deal for public housing to be implemented, regardless of where the funds come from. So I could just say, and then as to tenants, it's not a lot of science education here in public housing. So when we talk about climate change, most people do recognize environmental justice because I'm from the South Bronx, so people do see that. And then for me, it's a push for me to increase education through community gardening. So I have a garden here called Midwood Gardens, and we use this garden in order to educate people about sustainable, why it's important to be green. Well, then NYCHA doesn't have this thing that they educate people about like energy behaviors. A lot of people use air conditioners, especially when we have heat waves, but it's not their fault. It's more like you are basically had to do this because you're in a heat wave. So it's just a lack of education about these things. Right now, through Green New Deal for public housing, it's just one way, but there are other bills out there, that could be being introduced that could also need these initiatives or this agenda, this goals to green NYCHA. So I can't fully answer that question. All I know is that there's a lot of education needed.
Yeah, a lot of education is needed, and when we talk about really getting the word out, I think that's going to be key for a lot of residents and also the community, because the community isn't so much. I mean, while we do know there are problems in NYCHA, I think the overarching is that sometimes the general public is not aware as to a lot of the things that go on in terms of NYCHA and public housing. Some is due to ignorance, and some is due just to the fact that people have other concerns. But that's for the purpose of us, really getting together and having this conversation today to really make people aware as to what needs to be done and what can be done to really improve the state of NYCHA. And Kristen, if you can share with us a little bit, there's the acronym PACT, and I know that stands for the Permanent Affordability Commitment Together. And what can you tell us about PACT and its effects?
I want to go back to one thing you just mentioned, though, that like Cesar was also talking about this, like how and why people don't understand, right? Because actually it's really important towards what Ramona was saying, that Greg Russ and NYCHA have put a tremendous amount of energy and resources towards misinforming residents about what these plans are, right? So since like January, or even really since last year, Greg Russ has engaged a serious political public relations strategy where he's repeating that the public trust and the blueprint are this public to public transfer, and really not even discussing at all the alternatives like the Green New Deal for public housing. And there's been a real sort of just disregard for what's going on in RAD packed buildings, or buildings that were converted through RAD, just like ignoring the terror that tenants are dealing with in those buildings. And so the misinformation isn't just like about what people on the ground are doing or can doing. It's also that we're coming up against this real challenge where Greg Russ and NYCHA are intentionally creating misinformation. And we hosted a truth commission on RADPAC to like allow residents to give testimonies about the experience living in buildings that had been converted, because so far HUD and NYCHA and the city and elected officials have not done that inquiry. And as we were preparing for that event and moving forward with it, some groups started doing rent strikes or organizing more extensively. And NYCHA and the mayor put out a statement that said, that called organizing groups and residents, the work that they were doing was misinformation, right? And so there's not only them putting out misinformation, but they're also intentionally trying to delegitimize efforts that are trying to inform residents. I think that's important to understand for this context. And to your other question about what is PACT, so PACT is really just the version of RAD in New York City. So Rental Assistance Demonstration, or RAD, is the federal program that was designed by HUD. PACT is New York City's version or brand of RAD that we're implementing here. And how it differs a little bit is that across the country, RAD is converting buildings to Section 8 and usually using different kinds of subsidies in addition to the Section 8 funding, like low-income housing tax credits. In New York City, though they're not eligible for those tax credits, but what they're using in PACT is Section 18 to convert buildings to Section 8. And Section 18 allows developers and private partners to get more valuable federal subsidies. So instead of just Section 8. So it's these tenant protection vouchers that are being used in the blueprint, which are also being used in a lot of the RAD deals in New York City, which increase the amount of public money that the developer can get by unit. And that's packaged into RAD, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I'll add on what Kristen just mentioned was the lack of accountability that we see when it comes to RAD and PACT and how it's demonstrated itself with these slumlords. It has been years since HUD actually did a survey to measure the impact that RAD and PACT is having on public housing across the country, right? So one of the things I like to point out to folks is that until recently, NYCHA would say, we have 600,000 folks living in public housing. And starting in the summer, they started changing that number to 400,000. And the reason they're doing that is because they eliminated 200,000 units, right? 200,000 people are no longer considered living in public housing. And when those people try to go to NYCHA for support with repairs, we've seen chronic issues and capital expenses that are not being addressed. Even here in the South Bronx at Betances, which is a development that decided to go with RAD. At first, they were very happy, right? And everything was getting cleaned and everyone got a new stove and everybody got a fridge and they had ice and that was great. And then their pipes started bursting again. And NYCHA turned around and said, well, that's not our problem because you're no longer part of NYCHA. And then their management company, Kristen, it's Wavecrest, right? Wavecrest turned around and said, we can't handle your pipes because we don't own the building. We're just leasing it, right? So they don't like to talk about those issues. And the True Forum that Kristen held with Justice for All was recorded and it's out there for people to watch and to really gain an understanding of why we don't want folks to be saying no to conversions. A lot of the work that we do, Cesar and I as tenants, we see retaliation. I've gotten eviction notices twice for the stuff that I'm doing. Some tenant association presidents are harassed for the work that we're doing. And it is our federally guaranteed right that we can organize, educate, and participate in the management of our buildings per Section 9 coding, right? So when we look at folks, and we tell them, don't go for private. We always get that question of, well, then how do we fix it?
Mhm.
And, I think what Cesar was highlighting is that the Green New Deal is just one, set of values and principles. I like to tell folks the Green New Deal is like a religion. You either want to take your bread every Sunday or you just want to go to mass. Either way, NYCHA needs to be creating a resilient public housing stock that's going to last the next 100 years. And with the money that Chuck Schumer is trying to secure for public housing nationally, with the rights that we see Maxine Wright trying to protect for NYCHA and public housing across the country, there are other options, and to us, it's really interesting that in addition to making things dangerous for us, in addition to neglecting our homes for the last year and a half, the minute that Chuck Schumer and other Congress people started talking about funding, NYCHA refused to go out there with them. So every time you see Chuck Schumer at a development talking to tenants, talking to elected officials, and everyone wants to defend public housing, NYCHA is absent. And that's because to them, even if Chuck Schumer's money comes through, they still want to pursue privatization. And to us, that's a no-go. So if this leadership at NYCHA right now is, refusing to deviate from their plan, that leadership doesn't belong there, because we know we have options and that we have a right to be listened when we're talking about options, and that we have a right to be a part of the decision-making process when that option is chosen.
Right. Kristen, about the option, I mean, we talk about these various options and wanting to have a say in the process. How effective do you feel like your voice is in terms of being heard by many out there when it comes to the issues?
Yeah, I think in terms of being heard, I think that there's a real silencing that's happening, in part because of Greg Russ's media blitz. And he has basically wrangled a number of nonprofits and media outlets to publish in support of the blueprint, even though I think fundamentally some of these folks don't really understand what the blueprint really is and why it's different. And they also do not live in these buildings. So I actually think there's a lot of noise being made by outsiders and people who are being brought in with expertise to advocate for the blueprint in a way that is silencing residents and the opposition that's happening. But we have held at least actions this year, which did get picked up by the media. And I think that the movement is growing not only citywide and getting more folks involved through the work that the Save Section 9 campaign is doing and taking on this summer, but also we're trying to grow more nationally, because we also understand that the fight for public housing can't just be waged here in New York City or won based on the perspectives of elected officials here, right? We really need national consensus. And I think my particular interest in the writing work that I'm doing is about positioning the fight for public housing vis-a-vis the larger housing crisis, right? The loss of public housing in New York City would intensify gentrification in a number of these communities, because the way that they're actually going about repairing the buildings is by repairing the outside of the building, so that you can't tell this is what a lot of them, you can't even tell public housing is here, which means that property values for private developers surrounding those developments also goes up, and rents go up. So when people start getting displaced, they don't get displaced to their neighborhoods or even to New York City, right? They're now going into shelters, and shelters are another business plan in New York City, right? And in some cases, what we start to see when we start to look at who is making these decisions or politically advocating for the privatization of public housing, is that they're all affordable housing industry leaders who make money off of high rents in private market, who make money off of rent stabilized buildings and jacking those rents up, who are making money off of the homelessness crisis here in New York City, right? And the Save Section 9 campaign isn't really just about preserving public housing as it exists. It's actually arguing, I think, that public housing is the answer to the crisis that we're seeing, right? Since the 70s, as we've seen this trend towards subsidizing private investment in affordable housing, we're actually seeing that the levels of affordable housing are becoming shallower and shallower. and that the numbers of the affordable units are less and less, right? And so this is a bad direction in general for housing policy in the country. And that if we want to try to actually resolve the housing crisis, we need to do more direct public investment in housing, which is Section 9 is the only instance of direct public investment in housing in this country. So the Save Section 9 campaign is about preserving public housing and potentially getting to a place where we're talking about expanding that to house people who are currently unhoused or precariously housed, or might be losing their homes now due to this eviction crisis because of the pandemic. I know I answered the question, but
Yeah, can I add something today?
Yeah, I only have 1 minute left, so Cesar, I'm gonna let you get the last minute. Go ahead.
Well, yes, one thing that you notice is a Save Section 9. We're talking about Section 9 public housing everywhere throughout the United States. You know, BIPOC communities are the first to be affected by climate change, right? You know, everybody knows that that's the truth. So we're here to protect public housing outside of New York City as well, because they also face the same things that we do. And then a lot of these things are very cosmetic changes. They use sustainability, but and then it has some vagueness to it. If you want to be sustainable, you have to retrofit this building and make it sustainable that it lasts 100 years, not that it lasts 10 or 20 years, and then you got to spend a couple of more billions of dollars to update it again. So this is a push as well to redo it. So this is a push to be sustainable. And for people to be the leaders in sustainability in green infrastructure and green architecture, and why not us? Because you could also be part of the solutions for climate change. That's the way I see it.
Well, thank you all. I mean, obviously a conversation we need to continue to follow when it comes to NYCHA and the work going forward. And I know that we've had you on before. We'll definitely have you on again so we can continue to update the public, and best wishes and definitely raising your voice and creating an awareness, and glad that you could share it on this platform with us here at the Social Justice Forums.
Thank you so much for having us. I mean, it's great to be able to continue the conversation. And, you know, our petition is currently at about 3,500 signatures. And we're so proud of that because we've actually talked to 3,500 people in public housing. And we're going to continue to keep that work and come back and keep updating you. All
right. Well, make sure you do. And thank you all for joining us. All right. We are going to take a quick break here on the Social Justice Forums. We encourage you to stay with us. We'll be back with another guest right after this.